The telegraph key clicked its final desperate message into the storm-darkened afternoon of December 1876, then fell silent beneath Pandora Grimsby's bloodied fingers. She lifted her hand from the brass mechanism, studying the fresh burns across her knuckles, marks that matched the older scars threading up her forearms like railroad tracks. As her fingers throbbed, she was suddenly inexplicably transported back to a memory from 3 months prior. A little girl no older than 6, clutching a threadbare cloth doll as her family's wagon pulled away from their homestead. The child had dropped the toy in the mud as the railroad surveyors arrived, but her father couldn't stop to retrieve it. Pandora had watched from her office window as the girl pressed her face against the wagon's rear canvas, tears streaming as she watched her only companion disappear forever into the churned earth of progress. That image had haunted her dreams ever since 47 families, each with their own dropped dolls, abandoned dreams, severed connections. The burns on her hands were nothing compared to the searing knowledge that she could have prevented it all if she'd acted sooner. Outside the ramshackle telegraph relay shack, wind howled through the ghost town of Cinder Bluff, rattling loose planks and driving snow through gaps in the walls. She pulled her wool shawl tighter and bent over the notebook spread before her, transcribing the coded message she had just intercepted. Her near-perfect visual recall captured every dot and dash perfectly. But she wrote them down anyway. Insurance against the day her mind might fail her, or someone might demand proof of what she knew. The cipher pattern looked familiar. 4 long dashes, 3 short, 2 long. She had been recording similar sequences for 3 months now, ever since arriving in this flood-ruined settlement where no one asked questions about a young Norwegian woman living alone. The spring flash flood had been brutal to Cinder Bluff, leaving half the buildings collapsed into mud and the other half abandoned. Perfect cover for someone fleeing the Pinkerton detectives who still hunted her across 3 territories. Pandora touched the wanted poster folded in her coat pocket. The sketch artist had captured her angular face and pale eyes well enough to make travel dangerous. Telegraph operator turned thief, they called her. Information broker. Traitor to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Company. All true enough, though they would never understand why she had done it. The route changes she had sold to the competing line weren't for money, but for time, for those families to pack their lives and move before the surveyors arrived with their measuring chains and eviction notices. A sharp crack echoed through the shack as snow accumulated on the already sagging porch beam above. Pandora glanced up nervously, then returned to her work. The telegraph equipment was basic but functional, a battery box she had repaired with scraps of copper wire. The brass key connected to lines that still carried traffic between distant army posts and railroad offices. The messages she intercepted were always coded, always brief, always urgent. Someone was coordinating something important enough to encrypt. The brass key suddenly chattered to life, making her jump. Another message, this time longer than usual. She transcribed rapidly, dash, dot, dash, dot, 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 dash, dash, dot. Her memory absorbed every nuance, while her pen struggled to keep pace. This message was different, more personal, somehow less military in its rhythm. It spoke of children meeting places, sacred items that needed to be moved before winter deepened. Pandora was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the footsteps on the porch until the door creaked open. "Don't move." The voice was calm, deep-spoken in accented English. She looked up slowly, her hand still poised over the notebook, and found herself staring at a man who seemed to fill the doorway, despite being only average height. He wore a U.S. Army Scout's uniform blue wool jacket, with Corporal Stripe's campaign hat dark with snow. But underneath, she glimpsed something else entirely. A war shirt of soft leather, decorated with blue and white beads in patterns that seemed to tell a story. Bone hair pipes gleamed at his throat. His hair was black and straight braided with strips of red cloth, and his face bore the high cheekbones and bronze skin of the Lakota. Nayati Blackhorse stepped into the shack snow, melting from his shoulders, dark eyes studying her with laser-sharp intensity. She had seen that look before, the focused attention of someone who recognized danger when they saw it. "You're the telegraph operator. The town's been empty for months." Pandora kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I just maintain the equipment." He moved closer, and she caught a scent of pine smoke and leather, of long rides through winter forests. When he gestured toward her notebooks, she saw calluses on his fingers, from bowstrings, and rain scars, from knife work and rope burns. "Those messages you've been recording, do you know what they mean?" She glanced down at the open page, at the fresh transcription, still wet with ink. "Coded telegraph traffic. Military communications, probably. Or railroad business. Look closer." He knelt beside her chair, close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the small scar that curved along his jaw. "This pattern here, 4 long, 3 short, 2 long. What does that suggest to you?" His finger traced the marks in her notebook, and somehow their hands ended up touching his thumb, brushing across her burn-scarred knuckles. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, not of fear, but of something warmer, more complicated. She found herself studying his face, the aquiline nose, the mouth that looked capable of either tenderness or command, and the eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than winter lakes. "Don't look at me like that," she said quietly. "Like what?" "Like you're trying to decide whether to trust me." Something shifted in his expression, became almost gentle. "Maybe I am." She felt heat rise in her cheeks and forced herself to focus on the notebook. The pattern. It could be geographic coordinates, or dates, or... She paused, her near-perfect visual recall suddenly connecting details she had not consciously noticed. "Names. These aren't military codes at all, are they? They're family messages." Nayati's fingers tightened over hers. "What kind of family messages?" "Personal ones. Mothers asking about children, people arranging to meet. Someone looking for a lost medicine bundle that's sacred to your people, isn't it?" His silence was answer enough. Pandora felt the pieces clicking together in her mind like gears in a well-made clock. "You're the one sending them, or receiving them. You're using Army telegraph lines to coordinate with your people." "Some of my people," he corrected. "Families trying to reach safe camps before the worst of winter. Children separated from parents during the forced relocations. Elders who need specific medicines that only grow in certain places." She stared at him, understanding dawning. "You're playing both sides. You wear the uniform to get access to Army communications, but you're really helping your tribe evade the military. Survival requires many forms of courage." Before she could respond, a sound made them both freeze, the distant crack of a rifle shot, echoing across the snow-covered ruins of Cinder Bluff. Nayati was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with fluid grace. "Cavalry patrol," he said grimly. 6 riders, maybe 7, and someone else civilian clothes, railroad company badge. Pandora's blood chilled. "Pinkertons." "Close enough." He was already moving, gathering her notebooks with quick, efficient motions. "They tracked you here or they tracked me. Either way, we need to leave now." The beam snapped with a sound like thunder, and the entire porch roof collapsed in an avalanche of snow, mud, and rotting wood. The impact shook the whole shack. Nayati caught her around the waist, pulling her against his chest as debris crashed through the front wall. For a moment, they stood frozen together, his arms sheltering her, her face pressed against his shoulder. She could feel his heart beating fast beneath the decorated war shirt, could smell pine smoke in his hair, and the clean scent of his skin beneath the leather and wool. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough with concern. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. His hands lingered on her back, steadying her, and she found herself looking up into his watchful eyes. The intensity there made her breath catch, not calculating assessment, but something deeper, more personal. Through the gap where the front wall had been, they could see figures moving through the snow, men in blue cavalry uniforms and one in a dark wool coat who moved with the purposeful stride of a professional hunter. The civilian was shouting orders, pointing toward the collapsed shack. "Back way," Nayati whispered, guiding her toward the rear door. They slipped out into the alley between buildings, their feet crunching softly in the snow. Behind them, she heard the civilian's voice clearly now. "Search everything. The telegraph equipment, any records she might have kept. Railroad intelligence says she has an exceptional memory. She could be carrying years of stolen information in her head." Nayati pressed against her back, guiding her deeper into the maze of ruined buildings. His breath was warm against her ear when he whispered, "Do you have a horse?" "No. You. 3 hidden in the timber north of town. But we need to reach them without being seen." They crept through the shadows, using collapsed walls and snowdrifts for cover. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to timber, Nayati paused behind the skeleton of an old barn. He pulled a small brass whistle from beneath his war shirt and blew 3 soft notes so low they barely carried over the wind. Somewhere in the trees ahead, an answering call came back. "My men," he explained quietly. But as they prepared to make the final dash across open ground, Pandora heard something that made her stomach drop, the sound of dogs barking, still distant, but getting closer. They brought hounds. Her voice was barely a whisper. Nayati's jaw tightened. "Then we run. Now." They found the horses in a small clearing, 3 Indian ponies with blankets, instead of saddles, reins made of braided rawhide. 2 Lakota men waited with them, both younger than Nayati, both armed with repeating rifles that looked military in origin. When they saw Pandora, their faces hardened with suspicion. The taller of the 2 spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing toward her with barely concealed hostility. Nayati's response was sharp, authoritative, but the man persisted, his voice rising. Pandora didn't need to understand the words to grasp their meaning. They didn't trust her, didn't want her along, thought she would endanger them all. "What are they saying?" she asked quietly. "They think you're a liability," Nayati replied without looking at her. "They want to leave you behind." The second man joined the argument, pointing at her pale skin, her city clothes, the way she stood apart from their group. Pandora felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She had spent months in this wilderness, had survived on her own, had risked everything to help strangers. But to them, she was just another white face, another threat to their survival. "Tell them I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "We're in this together." Nayati boosted her onto one of the horses before the argument could continue, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her waist as he took the reins, and she found herself pressed back against his chest, acutely aware of his warmth and strength. They rode hard through the forest, following deer trails and creek beds, always moving away from the sounds of pursuit. The storm was their ally now, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. But the baying of the hounds grew steadily closer, echoing off the surrounding ridges like the voices of demons. After 2 hours of hard riding, they stopped to rest the horses in a sheltered valley. Nayati's companions went ahead to scout, leaving them alone, beside a small stream that ran black between snow-covered banks. The silence between them was charged with unspoken tensions. "They don't trust me," Pandora said finally. "Can you blame them?" Nayati's voice was carefully neutral. In their experience, white people who offer help usually want something in return. "And what do you think I want?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dim light. "I think you want to stop feeling guilty about those 47 families. I think you want to prove that what you did mattered." The accuracy of his assessment stung. "Is that so wrong?" "No. But it's not enough either. Good intentions don't stop bullets or feed hungry children." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "My people need to know you'll still be here when it gets harder, when the choices get worse, when helping us might cost you everything." "I'm here now, aren't I?" "You're here because you're running from something. That's different than running towards something." One of the scouts returned, then materializing from the trees like shadow. He spoke rapidly to Nayati and Lakota, his tone urgent. Nayati's expression darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Pandora asked. "Military patrol larger than the first one. Led by Lieutenant Pike, he's been hunting me for months. And they have the railroad man with them now." "How many?" 12 soldiers plus the civilian. Tracking dogs. They're moving fast, following our trail despite the storm." They mounted up again and rode deeper into the wilderness, but the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. As they crested a ridge, Pandora could see lights moving in the valley behind them. Lanterns and torches, at least a dozen of them, spread out in a search line that was slowly but inexorably closing in. The abandoned stamp mill mine yawned before them, like the mouth of some ancient beast, its wooden supports black with age and moisture. Nayati guided their exhausted horses to the entrance, where rusted machinery sat half buried in snowdrifts. "We go in on foot," he decided. "The animals stay here. If we're lucky, the patrol will think we kept riding." Pandora accepted his help, dismounting her legs, stiff from the cold ride. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, leaving an opening barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Water trickled from somewhere in the darkness beyond, and she could smell the dank odor of rot and stagnant pools. They squeezed through the opening and immediately found themselves ankle-deep in icy water. The mine had flooded partially, leaving a maze of tunnels and chambers filled with black pools that reflected their dim light like mirrors. Nayati had produced a small oil lamp from his pack, its flame casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The sound of their pursuers grew louder behind them. Horses arriving at the mine entrance, men dismounting, dogs barking with excitement as they picked up the scent trail. Pandora heard a voice she recognized, harsh and commanding. "Spread out, check every building, every hole in the ground. They can't have gone far in this storm." Silas Bragg. Railroad security, 20 years of hunting thieves and saboteurs, known for his methodical approach and complete lack of mercy. His voice carried the cold certainty of a man who believed that corporate progress justified any means necessary. Nayati guided her deeper into the mine, following what had once been the main tunnel. The water grew deeper, reaching their knees in some places, and the air became thick with the smell of decay and mineral deposits. Things moved in the water around their feet, rats swimming desperately from pool to pool, searching for dry ground that no longer existed. "Here," Nayati whispered, pulling her into a side passage that angled upward. "This leads to an air shaft. We can wait there until they give up the search." They climbed through the narrow tunnel, water dripping from the ceiling onto their backs. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to move in single file. Pandora found herself acutely aware of Nayati's presence ahead of her, the controlled rhythm of his breathing, the way he tested each step before committing his weight, the careful silence of his movements. The air shaft turned out to be a natural cave, that connected to the mine workings with a narrow chimney leading up toward the surface. It was dry, which felt like luxury after the flooded tunnels, but barely large enough for both of them to sit. Nayati extinguished the lamp, leaving them in complete darkness. "Don't move, don't speak," he breathed against her ear. "Sound carries in these caves." She nodded, though he could not see the gesture, then realized she was pressed against his side in the cramped space. His arm came around her shoulders, steadying her, and she found herself leaning into his warmth despite the awkwardness of their situation. Time stretched endlessly in the darkness. Below them, lights flickered in the mine workings as men searched with lanterns, their voices echoing off the walls. "Fresh tracks in the mud," someone called. "They're definitely in here." Lieutenant Pike's voice cut through the others, crisp with military authority. "Bragg wants every tunnel searched. These two have information that could compromise ongoing operations. The woman, especially railway intelligence, says she has a near-perfect visual recall. She could be carrying details about troop movement, supply routes, communication codes." Pandora felt Nayati stiffen beside her. The military implications of her stolen railroad information went far beyond what she had realized. In the darkness, his thumb traced small circles on her shoulder, absent unconscious comfort that sent unexpected warmth through her, despite the cold. "When this is over," she whispered, barely breathing the words, "they'll never stop hunting us." "I know. Your people at Cedar Pass, if we lead them there." "We won't." His voice carried quiet certainty. "There are ways through these mountains that no white man knows. Trails my grandfather used, paths that don't appear on any army map." Hours passed before the sounds of the search finally faded. Even then, they waited another full hour before Nayati risked lighting the lamp again. When they finally emerged from a concealed cave entrance on the far side of the hill, full darkness had fallen. "The horses?" Pandora asked. "Gone. They would have taken them or scattered them." Nayati surveyed the landscape, orienting himself by the stars. "But there's a line cabin about 5 miles north, a trapper named Otis Hale. He might help us." They walked through the night, following ridge lines and game trails that kept them above the valleys where pursuit would be most likely. The cold was brutal, not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. Ice formed on Pandora's eyelashes, and her breath came in short, painful gasps as the frigid air seared her lungs. Her feet, numb inside her boots, felt like blocks of wood attached to her ankles. Each step sent shocks of pain up her legs, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. When they stopped to rest, Nayati shared his buffalo robe, wrapping it around both of them as they sat back to back for warmth. Even through their layers of clothing, she could feel the solid strength of his back against hers, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Tell me about Cedar Pass," she said during one of these rest stops, her words creating small puffs of vapor in the frigid air. "It's a valley protected by high ridges on 3 sides," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Natural shelter from the worst winds, with springs that don't freeze even in hard winters. My people have used it as a winter camp for longer than anyone can remember." "How many families are gathering there?" 40, maybe 50. Mostly elders and children, the ones who couldn't keep up when the army forced the bands onto reservations. Some young mothers with babies. A few warriors who stayed behind to protect them. The image of those vulnerable families depending on them for survival gave Pandora strength to continue when her body wanted to quit. As they resumed walking, she found herself moving in unconscious synchronization with Nayati. Their steps matching their breathing, aligned as if they had been traveling together for years instead of days. They reached the line cabin just before dawn, a low structure built of logs and chinked with mud smoke rising from its stone chimney. Otis Hale opened the door before they reached it, shotgun cradled in his arms. He was a weathered man, with one leg missing below the knee, supported by a crude wooden crutch. "State your business," he called, his voice gravelly from years of solitude. "We need shelter," Nayati replied. "And maybe a horse if you can spare one." "Army Scout." Otis's eyes took in the uniform, but also the man wearing it. The braided hair, the beaded war shirt visible beneath the military jacket. "What's the Army's business with an old cripple like me?" "Nothing official. This is personal." Otis studied them both for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Finally, he stepped aside. "You look half froze. Come in, warm yourselves by the fire." The cabin's interior was sparse but warm, and Otis provided coffee and food while questioning them carefully about their journey. When Nayati mentioned Cedar Pass, the old trapper's expression grew troubled. "Railroad men came through yesterday," Otis said, stirring the fire with a poker. "Looking for a woman and a renegade scout. Offered $50 reward for information." "What did you tell them?" "That I hadn't seen anybody worth $50. Otis grinned, showing gaps where teeth had been. "But they said they'd be back today with dogs and more men. Said they had ways of making people remember things they might have forgot." The implied threat hung heavy in the air. While Otis gathered supplies for their journey, Nayati examined a wound on Pandora's shoulder where debris from the collapsed shack had struck her. His touch was gentle but efficient as he cleaned and bound the injury. "This might hurt," he warned. "Do it," she said through gritted teeth. As he worked, she found herself studying his concentrated expression, the careful precision of his movements. When his fingers brushed her collarbone while adjusting the bandage, she felt that same jolt of awareness she had experienced in the telegraph shack. "You're good at this," she said quietly. "Army Scouts learn basic medical skills, and my grandmother taught me about treating wounds." "Is she still alive?" "No. She died on the reservation 3 years ago, along with many others that first winter. Not enough food, bad water diseases we had no immunity against." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable. "The government called it civilization. We called it slow murder." His hands finished with the bandage and lingered for a moment on her shoulder, warm through the fabric of her dress. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "We should go," he said softly, but neither of them moved. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Otis's voice broke the spell. "Riders coming up the valley," the old trapper announced from the window. 6 or 7 horses moving fast. They found the concealed trapdoor to the root cellar and dropped into the small space just as hoofbeats thundered into the yard outside. Above them, boots stomped across the wooden floor. The front door banged open without ceremony. "Morning, old-timer." Bragg's voice filled the cabin, cold and businesslike. "We're looking for 2 fugitives, a woman and an Army deserter. They might have come this way." "Ain't nothing here but me and my old bones," Otis replied with convincing grumpiness. "Mind if we search the place?" "Seems like you're gonna whether I mind or not." The search was thorough and destructive. Someone kicked over a chair and Pandora heard the crash of pottery breaking. Then came the sound of wood splintering Otis's walking stick. She realized, followed by the thud of the old man hitting the floor hard. "Clumsy of me." Bragg's voice was matter-of-fact. "Hope that wasn't important to you, old man. Maybe you'd like to think again about whether you've seen our fugitives." Pandora felt rage flood through her at the casual cruelty. Beside her, Nayati's breathing had changed, becoming controlled and dangerous. She could sense him fighting the urge to emerge from hiding to protect the old man who was helping them. "Nothing in the other room," a soldier reported. "Lean-to's clean too." "Leave 2 men to watch the place," Bragg ordered. "And old man, if you're lying to me, I'll be back. And next time, I won't be so gentle with your belongings." Hours passed in the cramped cellar before they could safely emerge through a gap in the foundation. They made their way up the slope behind the cabin until they could see over its roof toward the watchers in front, and then climbed for an hour, following game trails, until the cabin had disappeared behind intervening ridges. When they finally stopped to rest, hidden among a stand of pine trees, Pandora broke the silence that had stretched between them since leaving the cabin. "That man helped us, and we repaid him by bringing trouble to his door." "Otis knew the risks," Nayati replied. But she could hear the guilt in his voice, too. He made his choice. Did he? Or did we make it for him by showing up at his door? She pulled her knees up to her chest, trying to conserve warmth. How many more people are going to suffer because of us? How many will suffer if we don't succeed? His voice was gentle but firm. Those families at Cedar Pass, children, elders, pregnant women, they're depending on the information in your head. Without those authentic messages, they can't tell which coordinates are real and which are traps. She knew he was right, but the knowledge didn't ease the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Every choice they made seemed to ripple outward, affecting people they had never met, might never meet. The trading post at Dry Spur perched on the edge of civilization, like a wooden growth on the mountainside. After 2 days of wilderness travel, dodging patrols and following game trails through increasing cold, the settlement felt almost metropolitan to Pandora's trail-weary senses. "Stay close," Nayati murmured as they approached the main building. Trading posts are neutral ground by tradition, but Bragg has money to spend on information. The establishment was larger than Pandora had expected, with several adjoining buildings and a steady stream of customers, trappers, prospectors, army contractors, and local settlers. They made their way inside, trying to blend in with the crowd while staying alert for signs of trouble. Behind the counter stood Dr. Mercy Lowell, a woman of perhaps 30, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She was serving a customer, but when she saw Nayati's uniform and Pandora's obvious exhaustion, her expression shifted to professional concern. "Looks like you could use some medical attention," she said quietly, finishing with her customer and moving toward them. Nayati explained that they had been in a riding accident, showing her Pandora's shoulder wound, which had begun to bleed through the makeshift bandage. Dr. Lowell nodded sympathetically and led them into her office, closing the door behind them. "Riding accident," she repeated dryly after examining the wound. "And I suppose the pursuit you're fleeing is just coincidence." When they tensed, she held up her hands peacefully. "I'm not your enemy. But I've been practicing medicine on the frontier long enough to recognize people running from something. The question is whether you're running from justice or toward it." Pandora made a spontaneous decision. Both, probably. Dr. Lowell smiled at the honest answer and began cleaning and rebandaging the wound. As she worked, she spoke knowledgeably about the harsh winter and the plight of native families trying to survive in remote camps. She seemed genuinely sympathetic to their situation, offering medical supplies and practical advice about avoiding the patrols that were scouring the territory. "There's a freight barn on the north side of town," Dr. Lowell said as she packed supplies into a canvas bag. "Empty this time of year, but the roof doesn't leak and there's hay for warmth. You can rest there safely until dark." "Why are you helping us?" Pandora asked. "Because I took an oath to do no harm, and sometimes that means harming the system instead of the people it's supposed to protect." But as they prepared to leave, Pandora noticed something troubling Dr. Lowell, speaking quietly with a grizzled prospector who had been lurking near the medicine counter. The conversation looked casual, but the way the man's eyes kept darting toward them suggested otherwise. At the freight barn, they discovered a wanted poster that made Pandora's blood run cold, $500 for her capture dead or alive. The amount was enough to turn every person in 3 territories into a potential bounty hunter. 500 is more than most men see in 2 years of honest work, Nayati said when she showed him the poster. Every settlement between here and Cedar Pass will be watching for us now. We could split up, she suggested, though the thought made her chest tighten with anxiety. No. His response was immediate and firm. We stay together. Whatever happens, we face it together. The intensity in his voice stirred feelings she was not ready to examine. They spent the remaining daylight hours planning their route and resting as much as the cold would allow. As darkness fell, they prepared to continue their journey. But as they gathered their supplies to leave, they heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching through the darkness. Not the random movement of travelers, but the purposeful advance of men who knew exactly where they were going. 6 riders, Nayati whispered from beside the barn door. Moving carefully, but they know we're here. How can you tell? They're not searching, they're surrounding. His face was grim in the starlight, filtering through the barn's gaps. Someone told them exactly where to find us. The realization hit Pandora like a physical blow. Dr. Lowell, she was too helpful, too accommodating. They slipped out the back of the barn into the bitter night. But instead of the empty field they expected, they found themselves facing a ring of armed men. Lanterns blazed to life around them, turning night into harsh, artificial day. At the center of the circle stood Silas Bragg, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. But beside him, still wearing her medical bag and looking stricken with guilt, was Dr. Mercy Lowell. Don't move, Bragg commanded, his rifle trained on Nayati's chest. Miss Grimsby, Mr. Blackhorse, you've led us quite a chase. Pandora found herself staring at Dr. Lowell, searching for some explanation, some sign that this was not what it appeared to be. For a moment their eyes met across the circle of guns, and Pandora saw tears on the other woman's cheeks, saw her mouth the words, "I'm sorry," in the lamplight. My father, Dr. Lowell said, her voice breaking. They have my father. Said they'd hurt him if I didn't. Enough. Bragg cut her off. You've done your part, Doctor. Now step aside. But the moment of distraction was all Nayati needed. He dove sideways, tackling Pandora to the ground as gunfire erupted around them. The lanterns scattered, plunging the scene back into darkness as men shouted and cursed, trying to find their targets without shooting each other. They rolled behind a pile of lumber bullets, splintering wood inches from their heads. Nayati returned fire with his rifle, the muzzle flash revealing their position, but also allowing him to target their attackers. One man screamed, and fell then another. The creek bed, Nayati shouted over the gunfire. 50 yards north. Can you make it? Go, she replied, though the thought of separating terrified her. Together, he said firmly. We go together. They ran crouched low, using the darkness and chaos to mask their movement. Bullets whined past them, but the confusion worked in their favor. Their pursuers were shooting at shadows and sound as likely to hit each other as their quarry. They reached the creek bed and followed it upstream, the frozen water masking their footprints while the banks provided cover. Behind them, the shouting gradually faded as Bragg's men realized their targets had escaped. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, hidden among boulders beside the stream, Pandora was shaking not from cold, but from rage and betrayal. She seemed so genuine, she said, her voice tight with anger. The concern, the willingness to help it, was all an act. Maybe not all of it, Nayati replied thoughtfully. Did you see her face when Bragg told her to step aside? That wasn't acting. She was genuinely distressed. Because she got caught. Because she had to choose between her father's life and ours. His voice was gentle but firm. What would you have done in her place? The question silenced Pandora's anger, replacing it with something more complex and uncomfortable. She wanted to maintain her sense of betrayal, to keep her emotions simple and clear. But Nayati was right. Dr. Lowell had been trapped in an impossible situation, forced to choose between two sets of innocent lives. I don't know, she admitted finally. They resumed their journey upstream, following the frozen waterway toward its source in the high peaks. The going was treacherous, with ice that might give way at any moment, and banks that offered little grip for climbing out if they fell through. But the water would confuse the tracking dogs, buying them precious time. As dawn broke, they could see their destination in the distance. Cedar Pass, a notch between two towering peaks that promised shelter and the end of their long flight. But they could also see signs of their pursuit smoke from campfires in the valley behind them, and the distant glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. They're not giving up, Pandora observed. Neither are we, Nayati replied, and helped her climb out of the creek bed toward the final ascent to the pass. But as they began the climb, neither of them noticed the figure watching from a concealed position high above Lieutenant Pike, who had anticipated their route and positioned himself to observe their approach. The military man lowered his field glasses and turned to his communications operator. "Send word to Bragg," he ordered. "Tell him they're heading for Cedar Pass just as we suspected. And tell him to bring the artillery." The high meadow spread before them, like a pristine bowl carved from the mountainside, surrounded by towering peaks that caught the morning sun and threw it back in blinding sheets of reflected snow. Cedar Pass was everything Nayati had promised, a natural fortress protected by geography and tradition, with springs that ran clear and cold despite the freezing temperatures. But today, the ancient sanctuary had become a killing ground. Pandora crouched behind a fallen log at the meadow's edge, studying the military positions that ringed the camp below. Pike had recovered from his earlier failures with remarkable speed, driven by professional humiliation and the promise of career redemption. He had brought overwhelming force, 2 full cavalry troops, civilian contractors' artillery pieces positioned on the surrounding ridges with clear fields of fire. 70 soldiers, maybe 80. Nayati estimated, his voice tight with controlled fury. Mountain howitzers on the south and east ridges, riflemen positioned to cover all the escape routes. Below them, the Lakota camp showed signs of hasty preparation for siege. But most of the people were elders, women and children, refugees, who had already been driven from their homes multiple times and had nowhere left to run. Pandora spotted familiar faces from the coded messages she had been transcribing. An elderly woman who had been searching for her lost grandson, a young mother with twin babies, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. "Wikasa," Nayati said, following her gaze. "He's been following us since Brindle Gulch. His mother is down there, along with his grandmother and 2 younger sisters." The child looked even smaller from this distance, a frightened boy trying to be brave, while his world collapsed around him yet again. The sight of him made Pandora's chest tighten with protective rage. "There has to be a way out," she said. "There is. But it leads through a narrow canyon that would bottleneck everyone into a killing ground. Pike's smart enough to have that covered too." They studied the tactical situation in grim silence, both understanding that conventional military options were limited. But as Pandora watched the scene below, her analytical mind began to work on the problem from a different angle. "The telegraph lines," she said suddenly. "They run right through this valley, don't they? That's how Pike coordinated this attack so quickly." "What about them?" "Communications are a weapon just like rifles or artillery. And I know how to use that weapon." She was already moving as she spoke, working her way around the meadow's perimeter, toward where telegraph poles marched across the landscape. "If I can tap into the lines, I can do more than call for help. I can turn Pike's own communications against him." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. While Nayati provided cover, Pandora climbed one of the telegraph poles with equipment she had salvaged and carried since Brindle Gulch. The ascent was treacherous, the wooden pole was slick with ice, and her hands already numb from cold could barely maintain their grip. But her months of working with telegraph equipment had given her the muscle memory and confidence she needed. At the top, she connected her portable key to the main lines, her fingers finding their familiar rhythm despite the brutal cold. But this time, she had a different strategy than simply calling for help. First, she began monitoring Pike's communications with his superiors, learning the station identifiers and codebook signals his operators were using. The military telegraph protocol was more complex than civilian systems, with multiple layers of authentication and verification. But Pandora's near-perfect visual recall allowed her to absorb and reproduce the patterns perfectly. Within an hour, she had mapped the entire communication network, who was talking to whom, which codes were being used, and most importantly, how the system could be subverted. Her first intervention was subtle. A message to Pike's artillery positions, apparently from his own headquarters, ordering them to adjust their aim coordinates by 50 yards. The adjustment would move their fire away from the camp and into empty hillsides. Her second message was bolder orders to the cavalry units on the eastern ridge to redeploy immediately to the western approach, where intelligence reports indicated a large force of hostiles was massing for a flanking attack. The message carried all the proper codebook signals transmitted with the mechanical precision that Pike's operators had come to expect from their headquarters. Below in the meadow, rifle fire erupted as Pike ordered a preliminary attack to test the camp's defenses. The Lakota warriors returned fire from concealed positions, but they were vastly outnumbered. Pandora could see muzzle flashes from both sides, could hear the sharp crack of rifles, and the deeper boom of the mountain howitzers. But then, something happened that neither Pike nor his superiors had anticipated. The mountain howitzer on the south ridge fired its first shot, not at the Lakota positions, but directly into the area where Pike had positioned his own command post, following the corrected coordinates that Pandora had transmitted. The explosion threw up a geyser of earth and snow, and when it cleared, Pike was screaming orders while his staff scrambled for cover. "Cease fire, check your coordinates." But the confusion was just beginning. The cavalry units on the eastern ridge were moving away from their positions, following the redeployment orders that Pandora had sent. Meanwhile, she was transmitting new instructions to the remaining artillery position reports of Pike's command post, being overrun by enemy infiltrators. Orders to provide immediate fire support at coordinates that would target Pike's own reserves. "What are you doing?" Nayati called up to her, watching the chaos spreading through the military positions. "Turning them against themselves." She called back her fingers, never pausing on the telegraph key, despite the pain of frostbite setting into her exposed skin. Pike's men don't know his communications have been compromised. They're following orders they think are coming from their own commanders. The second howitzer joined the confusion, firing on coordinates that Pandora had designated as enemy positions, but which were actually Pike's own supply wagons. The explosion scattered equipment and horses across the ridge, adding to the chaos as soldiers tried to understand why their own artillery was targeting them. But Pandora's masterstroke was yet to come. Using her complete knowledge of military communication protocols, she began transmitting a series of increasingly frantic messages from Pike's position to territorial headquarters reports of being surrounded by a much larger force than anticipated urgent requests for immediate reinforcement warnings that the entire operation was in jeopardy without immediate support. These messages, carrying Pike's own codebook signals and transmitted from his own communication lines, would bring help, but not for Pike. Within hours, territorial authorities would be dispatching federal marshals to investigate reports of an unauthorized military action against civilian refugees. As the morning progressed, Pike's coordinated assault dissolved into confusion and friendly fire. Artillery positions were firing on each other, cavalry units were chasing phantom enemies across empty ridges, and the infantry was pinned down by what they believed were their own misdirected shells. The sound of approaching horses came from the south, not Pike's scattered forces, but an organized column moving with official authority. Federal marshals responding to the distress calls that Pandora had sent in Pike's name, along with territorial officials and newspaper reporters who had been alerted to the developing scandal. "Lieutenant Pike." The voice carried across the meadow with unmistakable authority. "By order of the territorial governor, you will cease all hostile actions immediately and prepare to account for your conduct." Pike's response was unprintable, but he had no choice except to comply. His men began pulling back from their assault positions, while federal marshals moved in to secure the area and begin their investigation. But the damage had already been done. As Pandora climbed down from the telegraph pole, her hands so numb she could barely grip the rungs, she could see rescue workers moving among the casualties below. Pike's confused artillery barrage had taken its toll. Several people were dead or wounded, including an elderly woman and a young child, whose only crime had been seeking shelter in what should have been a place of sanctuary. "It worked," Nayati said, as they made their way down toward the camp. "Your strategy broke up their attack and brought help." "Not fast enough," Pandora replied, her voice hollow with grief and rage. "Not nearly fast enough. They found Wikasa sitting beside his grandmother's body, his small hands trying futilely to stop the bleeding from wounds that were already beyond help. The old woman's eyes were still open, staring at the sky with the peaceful expression of someone who had faced death without fear. But the boy was shaking, tears streaming down his face as he whispered words in Lakota that Pandora didn't need to understand. She knelt beside him gently, taking his bloodied hands in hers. The contact seemed to break something inside him, and he collapsed against her, sobbing with the desperate grief of a child who has lost everything that mattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her own tears falling freely now. "I'm so very sorry we couldn't save her." Wikasa looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "She said to tell you something," he said quietly, switching to English with the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned it as a second language. "Before she said to tell you that what you did mattered, that the messages you sent saved other families, even if they couldn't save her." Around them, the investigation was beginning in earnest. Federal marshals were taking statements, territorial authorities were documenting evidence, and newspaper reporters were recording every detail of what would soon become a national scandal. Pike was under arrest, Bragg was being sought by federal warrant, and the railroad company was frantically trying to distance itself from the entire affair. But for Pandora, the only thing that mattered was the boy in her arms, and the terrible knowledge that justice, when it finally came, was often too late for those who needed it most. The old woman's death was on her hands, not because she had caused it, but because she had not prevented it. The weight of that responsibility would follow her for the rest of her life. As the sun set over Cedar Pass, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and crimson, she held Wikasa close and whispered the words that would become her lifelong commitment. "Never again. I promise you never again. But even as she made the promise, she knew it was one that the world would make almost impossible to keep. By late 1879, the federal courthouse in Territorial City buzzed with controlled chaos. Reporters filled the gallery, their pencils scratching constantly as they recorded every word of testimony that would soon appear in newspapers across the nation. The case had captured public attention, not just for its dramatic elements, but for what it represented about the changing nature of the American frontier. The collision between corporate interests, military authority, and individual conscience. Pandora sat in the witness chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the intensity of the cross-examination she had just endured. 5 days of testimony had laid out the full scope of Bragg's deception in methodical detail, supported by the telegraph transcriptions that her memory had preserved with perfect accuracy. Miss Grimsby, the prosecutor continued, you testified that you can recall these telegraph messages with exact precision months after you originally transcribed them. But how can the court be certain that your memory has not been influenced by subsequent events, by your desire to see justice done? Because near-perfect visual recall doesn't work that way. She replied steadily, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone stating an irrefutable fact. When I recall a message I transcribed 3 months ago, I'm not remembering the content. I'm seeing the exact page where I wrote it down, complete with ink blots, torn corners, the specific pen I used, even the weather conditions outside the window. The memory is visual and immutable. It cannot be altered by wishes or desires any more than a photograph can be changed by wanting it to show something different. She had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, working with court-appointed experts to demonstrate the reliability of her unusual cognitive ability. The defense attorneys had challenged her testimony vigorously, but they could not shake her fundamental credibility. Every detail she provided could be verified against physical evidence. Every pattern she described matched the communication logs that had been seized from railroad and military offices. Across the courtroom, Silas Bragg sat with his legal team, his face a mask of controlled fury. The railroad security man had been charged with conspiracy fraud and misuse of the telegraph under federal statute. His defense had tried to paint him as a patriotic American protecting national interests from dangerous subversives, but the evidence was overwhelming. Lieutenant Pike faced military court-martial on charges ranging from insubordination to unlawful use of troops against civilians. His career was over. His reputation destroyed, but he maintained the rigid posture of a soldier even in disgrace. Dr. Mercy Lowell had initially been charged as a co-conspirator, but her cooperation with investigators and evidence that she had been coerced threatened with harm to her elderly father. If she didn't comply, had resulted in reduced charges and community service. She sat in the gallery, her face drawn with guilt and exhaustion, occasionally glancing toward Pandora, with expressions of mingled apology and gratitude. The court finds the witness's testimony credible and material to the charges. Judge Harrison declared after the defense finished their cross-examination. Miss Grimsby, you may step down. As she returned to her seat, Pandora felt a hand touch her shoulder gently. Nayati had been present for every day of the trial, no longer wearing his Army Scout uniform, but dressed in the practical clothes of a frontier businessman. His role as a playing both sides had been exposed during the investigation, but federal authorities had declined to prosecute him after determining that his actions had been motivated by humanitarian rather than treasonous purposes. "How do you think it went?" she asked quietly. "Better than we had any right to expect," he replied. "The newspapers are calling it the telegraph war, corporate greed versus individual conscience. Bragg will do prison time. Pike will be dismissed from the Army. and the railroad company will think twice before trying something like this again. The trial concluded 2 days later, with guilty verdicts on most of the major charges. Bragg received 7 years in federal prison, while Pike was dismissed from the Army, with loss of rank and benefits. The railroad company paid substantial fines and was required to submit to federal oversight of its security operations. But for Pandora, the most significant outcome was not legal, but personal. Standing on the courthouse steps as reporters shouted questions, she realized that her life as a fugitive was finally over. The charges against her had been dropped and the bounty hunters called off the wanted posters removed from telegraph offices across 3 territories. "The Chicago charges have been dropped," Nayati said, reading from a telegram. "Your former employer decided that prosecuting you would create more negative publicity than they could afford. You're free to go anywhere, do anything you want." The words should have filled her with relief and excitement. Instead, she felt strangely empty, as if the goals she had been pursuing had turned out to be less important than the journey itself. "What about you?" she asked. "What will you do now?" "I've been offered a position with the territorial government liaison between federal authorities and the tribal councils helping to negotiate solutions that don't involve military force. It's not glamorous work, but it might prevent some of the problems we've been dealing with." "That sounds perfect for you." "Maybe, if I can convince a certain telegraph operator to work with me." His smile was gentle but serious. "The position comes with authority to hire staff, and I can't think of anyone better qualified to handle complex communications than someone with a near-perfect visual recall and a proven ability to decode enemy intentions." Pandora looked at him in surprise. The offer was generous, professional, and completely unexpected. But more than that, it represented something she had never thought to hope. For a chance to use her skills for something meaningful, to be part of building rather than just surviving. "Are you asking me to work for you?" she said. "I'm asking you to work with me, as an equal partner in something that matters." The distinction was important, and she could see in his eyes that he understood why. Their partnership had been forged in crisis and tempered by shared danger, but it had grown into something deeper, a connection based on mutual respect, complementary abilities, and shared values that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. "Yes," she said simply. They walked away from the courthouse together, leaving behind the reporters and legal proceedings and public attention. At the end of the street where the town gave way to open country, they paused to look back at what they were leaving behind. "Any regrets?" Nayati asked. Pandora considered the question seriously. She thought about her life in Chicago, the comfortable routine of her railroad job, the predictable safety of civilization. Then she thought about the past months, the danger and hardship, but also the sense of purpose, the knowledge that her actions had made a difference in real people's lives. "No," she said finally. "No regrets." As they prepared to mount their horses for the journey to their new life, Nayati touched her hand gently. "One more thing," he said. "About what you said that first day in the telegraph shack about not looking at you like that." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, remembering the moment when their hands had first touched over her notebooks, when she had felt the electric connection that had frightened her with its intensity. "What about it?" "I'm going to keep looking at you like that, if that's all right with you." This time, when he looked at her with that intense, searching gaze that had once made her uncomfortable, she did not step away. Instead, she moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath on her face. "That's all right with me," she said softly. They kissed then there on the edge of town, with the vast frontier spreading out before them. It was not the desperate embrace of people clinging to each other in crisis, but something gentler and more lasting, the kiss of partners who had chosen to face whatever came next together, who had found in each other not just survival, but purpose. When they finally separated, Nayati smiled at her with an expression that held promises of shared adventures, mutual challenges, and the kind of deep partnership that could weather any storm. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked. "Ready," she replied. They rode out of town together as the sun began to set behind the mountains, two people who had found in each other not just survival, but meaning. Behind them, the legal proceedings would continue. The newspapers would print their stories, and the slow work of justice would grind forward. But ahead of them lay the open country, and the knowledge that they had work to do, important work, that would help other families avoid the suffering they had witnessed, other children grow up free from the fear that had shadowed Wikasa's young life. 3 years later, on a crisp autumn morning, Pandora stood in the doorway of the Territorial Liaison Office, watching as a young Lakota man approached on horseback. He was taller now, no longer the frightened child she remembered, but she recognized him instantly, Wikasa, grown into the warrior his grandmother had known he would become. He dismounted and walked toward her, with the confident stride of someone who had survived great loss and found strength in that survival. In his hands, he carried a medicine bundle, carefully wrapped in red cloth, and his eyes held the wisdom of someone who understood that pain and hope were not opposites, but partners in the dance of life. "Miss Pandora," he said, using the name he had called her as a child. "I brought you something." He unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a small piece of beadwork, a telegraph key worked in blue and white beads, surrounded by traditional Lakota symbols for family communication and hope. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each bead placed with the precision of someone who understood that some messages are too important to risk to words alone. "My grandmother started this before she died." He explained, his voice steady and proud. "She wanted you to have it, to remember that what you did mattered, that the messages you sent saved my cousins, my aunts, my friends. She said you kept our families talking to each other when others tried to silence us forever." Pandora accepted the gift with trembling hands, feeling the weight of its meaning. The beadwork was warm from his touch, alive with the love and hope that had been sewn into every stitch. "What are you doing now?" she asked. "Working with the tribal council, helping to set up new communication networks between the camps. Teaching children to read and write in both languages. Making sure the stories survive, that the connections remain strong." He smiled, and she could see his grandmother's strength shining in his face. "Same as you, I guess. Making sure people can talk to each other, can find each other when they get lost." After he left, Pandora sat at her desk, holding the beaded telegraph key and thinking about the paths that had brought her here. Through the window, she could see Nayati returning from a meeting with federal officials, his face showing the satisfied tiredness of someone who had spent his day doing work that mattered. When he entered the office, she showed him Wikasa's gift. He examined it carefully, running his fingers over the intricate beadwork with the reverence it deserved, and then looked up at her with profound satisfaction. "She was right, you know," he said quietly. "About what you did mattering. About keeping families connected." "We did," Pandora corrected gently. "We kept them connected." He moved behind her chair, his hands settling on her shoulders, in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past 3 years. "Don't look at me like that," she said softly, repeating the words from their first meeting with a smile that took all the sting out of them. "Like what?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "Like you're proud of what we've accomplished together." "I am proud," he said simply, "and I always will be." She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steady reassurance of a partnership that had been tested by fire and found to be unbreakable. Outside their window, the frontier continued its slow transformation. But they had found their place in that change not as passive observers, but as active participants in building a society that was more just, more compassionate, and more worthy of the magnificent landscape that surrounded them. In her hand, the beaded telegraph key caught the afternoon light, its blue and white patterns telling a story of communication across distances of families staying connected, despite all the forces that tried to drive them apart. Of two people who had learned that the most important messages are not always the ones that travel over wires, but the ones that pass between hearts that have chosen to trust each other completely. The telegraph lines outside their window hummed with constant traffic messages of commerce and government personal communications and official business, the endless flow of information that kept the frontier connected to the wider world. But Pandora knew that the most important communication of all was the one that required no wires, no codes, no special equipment, just two people who had chosen to face whatever came next together, speaking the language of partnership that needed no translation. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she set down the beaded telegraph key and turned to face the man who had become not just her partner in work, but her partner in all the adventures yet to come. Whatever messages the future might bring, they would decode them together, just as they had learned to decode the language of love that had grown between them, slowly, carefully, and with the absolute certainty that some connections are strong enough to last forever. The work would continue, the challenges would come, and somewhere in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, other families would need help finding their way home. But they would face it all together, two hearts beating in perfect synchronization, two minds working as one, two souls joined by the unbreakable bond of shared purpose and mutual love. In the distance, a telegraph key began its familiar clicking, carrying someone's urgent message across the vastness of the landscape. Pandora listened to its rhythm with the trained ear of a professional, but she did not move to decode it. That was work for tomorrow, for the next crisis, for the next family that needed help finding its way through the maze of a changing world. Tonight, she had everything she needed right here in this room. The beaded symbol of lives saved the steady presence of the man she loved, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their story had become part of something larger than themselves, woven into the great tapestry of human connection that no amount of distance or danger could ever completely sever.